Hello, and thank you for tuning in to listen to my podcast, Explaining the AIDS Epidemic to My Sister. With me, I have my sister, Audia. Audia, say hi.
Hello, everybody.
And she is calling in all the way from Savannah so I can explain to her the different collections within our library at Georgia State that focus on the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s to the 1990s. Audia, do you have any previous knowledge of this time period in reference to AIDS specifically?
I have a pretty general knowledge, I would say. I wouldn't say any more than the average person, but I am slightly familiar with it.
Okay. Well, I'll just kind of explain the process of this podcast and what exactly I'm going to talk about. So I went through about 4 different collections at the library. And if you're unaware, the collection at the library kind of has different archived pieces of history, like firsthand accounts of people who went through a certain event. Specifically, they kind of surround like Georgia topics or whatnot. And I chose to primarily focus on the AIDS epidemic. So I'm sure you're aware that in the 1980s to the 1990s, the U.S. faced a national health crisis known as the AIDS epidemic. During that time, it was sort of a new virus, and it was extremely deadly, and it claimed the lives of many and disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Do you happen to know which community it primarily affected, or still affects to this day?
I believe it largely affected people of color, Black people, and people in the LGBT community.
Yes, that's a very good point. The LGBTQ communities and marginalized communities pertaining to race were definitely disproportionately affected. And so while this AIDS epidemic was running rampant and literally destroying whole communities of people, it became fear evolved into very harmful prejudices against members of the LGBTQ community. And of course, the government's inability to disperse prejudiceness and discrimination against these people due to the resurgence of AIDS brought about a powerful push and a need for activism, like on the ground activists, and new research on what this disease was and how it spreads and how it affected people. So the best way to kind of describe what was happening during this chaotic time period is kind of looking or listening and reading firsthand accounts of people who experienced it. So the first collection that I went through was the Atlanta Gay and Lesbian Center Records, identifier Q124. And I looked at the collection that was labeled Land's HIV Treatment Strategy from 1994. This was created or donated to the library on March 19th, 2013. And it focuses on the research findings of Lark Lands. Important, okay, history. She was a PhD researcher and an educator. She published numerous fact sheets, monographs, informational packets across the USA and Europe, and she was an aggressive advocate for treatment, and she encouraged doctors to aggressively treat the symptoms of the patients that they had with HIV before it turned into the critical condition known as AIDS. So the primary focus of her research revolved around the idea of boosting the amount of nutrients in order to boost the immune system to stave off symptoms. Now, Audia, you happen to work in a hospital as a CNA, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Do you happen to know any scientific reason as to why we might need nutrients in order to boost our immune system to stave off infections?
Well, your immune system is what is targeted when you contract AIDS, and when you contract the virus, it stays with you forever, and it moves throughout your bloodstream and attacks your lymphocytes. And because you have a low count of lymphocytes, your body is unable to fight against infection and disease like it usually would. So eating things with high nutrients help to boost your natural defenses and help you fight back.
Exactly. That's a very good description. Thank you. So HIV does lead to symptoms like dehydration, IBS, diarrhea, and vomiting. That's something that Lance talks about in her research. And she talks about how eating or replenishing your nutrients because of these symptoms helps repair tissue damage and your immune system to stave off various diseases and infections. And primarily within, which I found kind of interesting, she really just talks about taking a holistic approach to treating HIV, as well as a more traditional one with new developments within antivirals that were taken when a patient's T cells have reached the appropriate levels and things of that nature. I found that really interesting because I feel like within the Western world, we tend to focus primarily on traditional medicine as the cure, but in this research, she really, really pushes doctors to encourage their patients to focus on nutrition. How do you feel about that?
I think that's excellent. I think teaching people how to have a well-rounded diet, hand in hand with modern medicine, is very beneficial. Some people believe it, you need to do one or the other, but they really benefit each other when you are being mindful of what you eat and following your doctors and medical professionals' directions.
Right, and another aspect that Lance talks about within this collection, she talks about the importance of mental health. One of her mottos within it is rest over stress, and she talks about how vigorous exercise and a positive attitude helps with the healing process. I feel like that's really important because since this disease is so quick with its kind of devastating impact, it's kind of leaves you kind of susceptible to feeling helpless and not wanting to take care of yourself as much. So I feel like maintaining your mental health is a good issue that she brought up. She also talks about quality versus cost and different scheduling consults for patients who are probably financially struggling. And she also encourages doctors to pay attention to rapidly changing research within that field. I feel like this collection was very important to discuss when talking about the AIDS epidemic because Lark Lance seems to be a very influential person within the field of research for AIDS, and it kind of gives insight to people who are experiencing this devastating disease and what it literally gives step-by-step instructions of what type of foods to eat, such as foods rich in like antioxidants, B12, multivitamins, vitamin E, zinc, and all that, when to take them, how often, how to treat infections. It's just a very thorough amount of research pamphlet, or basically, and it's a great resource for people who are experiencing that disease. Further on, there was another really cool collection that I went through, entitled Jeff Cornett Papers Q184, which was donated February 7th in 2020. The folder that I went through was entitled Pamphlets, Flyers, HIV/AIDS, Women and Children, 1987 to 1990. And this collection was donated by Jeff Cornett, who was a nurse and a public health advocate during that time within the LGBT community. And I feel like he was important to note because just how Lark Lance was really encouraging doctors and HIV patients to look into new research and aggressively treating this disease and informing themselves. Jeff Cornett kind of also took that same approach as well, but kind of reaching a broader audience. So within his collection, or within that folder specifically, he created a lot of pamphlets and informational flyers that kind of gave information about this disease, how it was spread, how it affects families and such. It even gives resources to women or to families who are experiencing housing crisis due to the effects of the disease. So one of the pamphlets specifically was kind of devastating for myself to read, was how to talk to your kids about AIDS. And it basically kind of was an informational pamphlet handed out to parents who have gotten a diagnosis recently and how to talk to their children about it. So basically explaining like how they got it, why it's hard to catch, the fatality, explaining how eventually you will be made victim to the disease, and also encouraging parents to talk about safe sex practices. And even within the pamphlet, which is just another gut-wrenching aspect to it, it talks about how to talk to different demographics of children. So how to talk to your 2-year-old compared to like your 16-year-old. So yeah, that one was kind of a hard read for sure. I think another pamphlet that was in there was entitled "Common Questions from Women." It talks about who to get in contact with, and hotlines or agencies you can reach out to when you've been sexually assaulted and then given this disease. It gives information to prostitutes or people participating within prostitution, and what to do if they have been made in contact with the disease. It talks about pregnancy and breastfeeding. Would you happen to know how women could possibly spread this disease to their children?
I would assume through the usual routes like bodily fluids or congenitally coming through the birth canal. And I would guess, I'd make an educated guess about it coming through the breast milk, since that is part of it's coming out to your body, and that's something your body naturally produces.
Yeah, that's something that they directly talk about within this pamphlet. It, especially in this one, Common Questions from Women, it really talks about like the myths and the truths about what to expect when you've been diagnosed with this as a woman and when you're breastfeeding your children. And it talks about how to get food for your infant essentially when you can't provide milk for them. There was another flyer in there entitled "How AIDS Are Transmitted," and it was very incredibly straightforward and like bold text letters. Like you get it from sleeping with men who have the virus through semen, needles, virus to infants through breast milk. It gives a hotline of what to do if you feel like you've been exposed. So yeah, this was mainly the pamphlets and informational flyers were mainly the context of this folder within the collection, and I feel like it's really important, especially during that time period, because since it was such a new disease and it was just taking people so rapidly, it just instituted a lot of fear, and fear contributes to the spread of the disease, right? If you don't know. If you don't know, then you won't do, essentially. Like, if you don't know how devastating it is to have a diagnosis and you just go about your everyday life like it's not happening, you could potentially be putting other people's lives at risk. And I think that also kind of stemmed from, like, the prejudiceness that LGBTQ people faced during that time period, too. like that misinformation or the not really wanting to know, like, if what's going to happen to you or going into the doctor's office. It just all kind of fed into that fear, which is why I feel like pamphlets like these, which kind of simplified or made people feel like that there are resources out there, were extremely important during this epidemic. So another collection that I went through was entitled Andrew P. Wood Papers Q121. It was donated in the month of August in 2014. And this was donated by Andrew P. Woods. He was an activist during this time period, and I think he was primarily active during like the mid 1990s. He worked within the gay community during the AIDS crisis, and specifically with Atlanta ACT UP chapter, which is an organization that helps assist people with a diagnosis, like setting up protests and things of that nature. And this was pretty cool. There was he donated an actual mugshot of himself. So there's a folder entitled Mugshot and Court Summons, which is just the name of it. He was arrested 1990, January 9th, and on his court summons, they wrote down the reason he was arrested was because he halted the flow of traffic, and there was also like a check for his bail within there as well. And in the photo, he's just looking straight at the camera and like smirking. So, and I think this was kind of important to include because it kind of shows the lengths that people are willing to go in order to spread awareness about people who had a diagnosis and who were kind of fighting for their humanity. There was another folder within this entitled Photographs circa late 1980s. There were a lot of photographers who took the photographs in this folder, but mainly Andrew P. himself. And it was kind of just documenting the lives of LGBT community members in order to spread awareness. Some of the photos had like just pictures of organization members of ACT UP. They even had photos of people who were trans, like prostitutes and drag performers. The one I found the most interesting was the one that Andrew took of himself hanging a banner across a freeway entitled Boycott K Food Stores, Fight AIDS, which I guess you can infer that this food chain was discriminating against people who had a diagnosis. But I feel like this is important to note because it kind of shows the community that people had with each other when fighting against this epidemic, and it shows some of the humanity of the people who had a diagnosis and were struggling to get people in the country to care, and were kind of putting their personal safety at risk, like by getting arrested in order to spread awareness about this disease and its harmful effects. So yeah, there was a lot of cool aspects within the collections library to kind of discuss this epidemic. I think mainly the beginning of this AIDS epidemic through the 90s or through the 80s was primarily marked by like an outcry and a need for better medicine and visibility of people within the LGBT community. And these collections sort of describe the rapid amount of research that started to develop a little bit later on and the efforts of people, of on-the-ground activists, that really made it possible for people to care, which is a crazy thing to state, that you have to care for another human being. But to honestly, care for people, for HIV and AIDS victims. Any closing thoughts you have about this as a person who works in the healthcare industry or profession?
I found this very informative, and I also found the information about the people who donated their own stories and their own knowledge inspiring as well, even though some of it was hard to listen to, and I'm sure hard for you to read. But I think that I agree in that education helps make everyone safer, as well as dispel harmful stigmas that others may have of people who live with this disease. And I think that continuing to push for education of adults and even children as well, it can be taught in an age appropriate manner. And yes, I enjoyed the information.
Yeah, and before we close out, I think it's important to note that collections like these are essential for us to upkeep and maintain, for future historians, because in order for progress to happen, we have to know what happened historically. So within like the Lark Lands collection, where she talks about research, like, it can be important for people to know how we move forward within A's research and where we've come from. And she kind of set the groundwork for that. And I think it's important for historians to know the faces of people who were on the ground and who were affected through this crisis by upkeeping photographs, like in the Andrew Wood Papers collection. And it's important to know like the severity of how badly, or how it's a terrible thing for misinformation to kind of affect people's lives through, by looking at pamphlets and stuff, and just kind of seeing how important it was to kind of spread awareness through the Jeff Cornett papers. So yeah, thank you for talking with me. I know it's kind of a heavy subject, but it was very cool to get your insight as somebody who's working right now in the healthcare profession. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Alrighty.